Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
I know that some people say that Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but honestly, I kind of disagree because, well, in some ways, I like Thanksgiving a whole lot better. Stick around and I'll tell you why.
Welcome to Authentic. Sean Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Sean with this week's episode of Authentic.
Well, it's that time of year yet again, my favorite holiday, that purest of holidays known as Thanksgiving. But maybe instead of pure, I should use the word simple, because apart from making dinner, really how complicated is this holiday? Valentine's Day, birthdays, Christmas, they're all fine in their place, but they come with a much higher level of expectation. I mean, for starters, you've got presents to deal with and decorations and office parties and you name it. But Thanksgiving, it's really just a matter of giving thanks. I mean, sure, a lot of people will decorate for Thanksgiving. They'll make little paper turkeys and put out some pumpkins, but still it's simpler than the other holidays. It really can be pure and simple. It can just be about practicing the art of gratitude, which is one of the greatest tools we have in our mental health toolkit. And I'm starting to get the feeling that maybe in this generation we could afford to be a little more thankful. I think it might help. I mean, think about it. Here we are, one of the most prosperous generations to ever walk the face of the earth, and yet we still seem to find lots to complain about. And if I'm really honest, I'd have to tell you that I still find a lot to complain about, because there's an awful lot going on in our present world that just isn't right. And I do believe that Western civilization is in decline. And the older I get, the grumpier I feel about some of the foolishness that's going on out there. I used to wonder why older guys were so cranky all the time, and now I kind of get it. I mean, my days on this planet are decidedly numbered now, and I just don't have any time to be patient with dumb ideas. I mean, I've already made my mistakes, and now I just want to get about the business of living my life. And I'm guessing if you're a middle-aged man, I'm not alone. But today is not the day for cranky. Today is the day for gratitude, because this is Thanksgiving week. So here's what we're going to do. For the next however long we've got, we're simply going to be thankful. And if you struggle to do that, think of it as a personal favor to me. Think of it as saving a kind of old cranky guy from turning into a full-blown grumpy old man. So, right now, I'm thinking about that story in the Bible where David brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. He'd been building himself a palace, which was cause enough to celebrate. But it really bothered him that he was living in such a nice place when the Ark of the Covenant was somewhere else, in a tent. What he wanted to do was build a temple, but as you probably know, God forbid that because David was a man of war and he had too much blood on his hands. Yet still that didn't stop David from moving the needle as far as possible to get the temple built, even knowing that he'd have to leave the actual construction to somebody else. And that somebody else, of course, would be Solomon. Now, for a little bit of chronological perspective, God actually told David that after he moved the ark. And maybe one day we'll want to talk about it. But for right now, I want you to see something especially relevant to this season in this story where the Ark of the Covenant gets moved. You'll find this in 1 Chronicles chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. It says, "And they brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God." So you'll note there's a great deal of happiness that this sacred piece of furniture representing the presence of God has now been moved to the holy city, where it would stay for a really long time. It continues, "And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord and distributed to all Israel, both men and women, to each a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins." So you'll notice it's kind of like a Thanksgiving feast in the way that David celebrates by feeding everybody. The fact that they were the chosen people of God, the descendants of Abraham, who had been tasked with revealing the love of God to the world, well, that's a lot to be thankful for. The story continues in verse 4. It says, "Then he appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord, to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel." Now, of course, the Levites were a special tribe whose entire life was centered in the sanctuary and its services. And according to this, David expected them to perform three key tasks. Number one, they were supposed to invoke God or pray to Him on behalf of the people. Secondly, they were supposed to praise the Lord or lead in the worship of God, representing the people in front of God's throne. But thirdly, and I don't want you to miss this, the Levites were appointed to thank God. I mean, imagine going to Monster.com or LinkedIn to go look for a job, and as you're reading through one of the job descriptions, you find gratitude as one of the tasks you're expected to perform. You'd be a professional thanker. And I guess the point here is that God actually built gratitude right into the national structure of Israel. And if you keep on reading this chapter, you'll find it absolutely drenched in thankfulness. I mean, here, let me read you just a little bit more, starting down in verse 7, where it says, "Then on that day, David first appointed that thanksgiving be sung to the Lord by Asaph and his brothers." Gratitude was so important to the life of God's people that David told Asaph, a notable Levite musician, to sing songs of gratitude. And then we get the following passage, which I'm just going to read to you, or at least I'm going to read a fairly large part of it. This is a song that was sung by David himself, and you'll find parts of this song scattered all through the book of Psalms. Some of it you'll find in Psalm 96, and you'll find the rest of it in Psalms 105 through 107. But let's read this version. And what I want you to do as we're reading it is ask yourself why David is so grateful, what he's grateful for, and how that might apply to you and me today. In fact, you might want to consider sharing this song with your family on Thanksgiving. Just sit down and read it out loud at dinner, because there's a lot of material here to help us develop a healthier attitude. So here we go, starting in 1 Chronicles 16 and verse 8, where it says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon His name, make known His deeds among the peoples." So right out of the gate, we can ask ourselves, what has God done for me? And that's a really important question, because most of us have a much easier time remembering our disappointments and our hardships than we do the good things. And I guess that's somewhat natural, because when really bad things happen, they kind of traumatize us. They leave a scar on our psyche that continues to plague us for years to come. So far too often, these bad things kind of overshadow the good. But a serious problem emerges when we allow those traumas to define who we are. Now, I'm not a professional counselor and I'm not a trained psychologist. So if you're dealing with real trauma like PTSD, you want to get some qualified help. But still, it's my conviction that most of us are as happy as we choose to be. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who actually said that, and I'm convinced he wasn't wrong. When you think about what he went through, trying to hold the American Republic together during a massive crisis and presiding over a war that cost something like 600,000 American lives, well, you'd think it'd be hard to be happy. We know he suffered from terrible depression, and this was in the years before most people recognized clinical depression as an actual medical condition instead of some kind of moral issue. Back in 1860, when Lincoln walked onto the stage at the Republican convention in Decatur, people noticed that he wasn't a happy man. In fact, one man who was present that day said, "I then thought him one of the most diffident and worst-plagued men I ever saw." And that was at the height of his popularity, right before he went to the White House. And speaking about taking things, it's time for me to take a really quick break. So don't you go away. I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Okay, just before the break, I was talking about Honest Abe, easily one of the more popular presidents in U.S. history. I mean, even his enemies begrudgingly admired him, and he seems to have found a permanent place on our currency because of his performance. But I was also talking about the fact that he suffered from depression. He was known to have a wicked sense of humor, and some of his witticisms have become legendary. But what he said about that was that he needed the laughs just to survive. And that's the man who said most folks are as happy as they make up their minds to be. So in other words, he discovered that you have a choice. And in 1 Chronicles 16, we find exactly the same principle. Gratitude was actually written into the national life of Israel. No matter what happened every other day, you were expected to practice gratitude when you approached the throne of God. So, in other words, you could choose to be thankful. So David's song actually starts with an admonition to be grateful, a command, if you will. Here's verse 8 again. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon His name, make known His deeds among the peoples. So, you'll notice it's not just a matter of being grateful yourself. David's subjects were supposed to spread their gratitude. They were supposed to tell people why they were thankful. Say it out loud. Because there's something about formulating your positive thoughts into meaningful statements that makes them even more real. You know, on one occasion, Jesus had to explain that it wasn't the improper practice of rituals that actually makes a person ritually unclean. It's the thoughts that you allow to percolate in your heart. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus said, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person." And of course, you've got to ask yourself, how in the world does all that ungodly and negative material get into your brain in the first place? Well, you might be able to blame some of it on your background because when you were a little kid, you really didn't have much choice about your environment. And sometimes that leads us to believe that we don't have any choice the rest of our lives. But according to the Scriptures, that's just not true. I mean, of course, a lot of things happen to us in this world, and we don't always have control over what those things are, but we can still choose how we respond. As one of my daughters recently pointed out as she was writing about some of the difficult challenges she had growing up, she said, "I believe we have two choices in life. Let it break you and become hardened with every negative experience, or choose to exude love and joy because that's what the world needs most." Now, it's not my place to tell you exactly what my daughter went through because that's her story to tell. But I can tell you she had a lot to complain about, and it was really pretty brutal. And I can also tell you that she really does practice what she preaches, and she's a lot better than I am at spreading joy and gratitude. And she's tapped into the way the Bible teaches us to handle the brutal reality of living in this broken world. Most of us have to be reminded that gratitude is a choice, that we don't have to let the things that happen to us break us. It really is a choice you can make. So David reminds his people to make that choice. They have the presence of God right in their midst, after all, and the rituals associated with the tabernacle were designed to remind them that God is very much interested in redeeming us. So now let's go on to verse 9. It says, "Sing to Him, sing praises to Him, tell of all His wondrous works. Glory in His holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice." So now we find David anchoring his gratitude in the holy name of God. And that's a particularly important point that shows up in the last pages of prophecy. In Revelation 14, for example, we find the people of God standing on Mount Zion with the Father's name written in their foreheads. The forehead, of course, symbolizes the mind, the place where you make your moral decisions. And what it's telling us is that our choice to celebrate who God is changes us at a fundamental level. It actually changes how we think. Now, I've pointed this out on other episodes, but this is really important. I've met people who insist that God's name is some kind of secret word that only a few enlightened people actually know. And sometimes those people will insist that everybody has to pronounce God's name a certain way and only that way. And then they'll point to passages like this one, the ones that talk about the importance of God's name. But in Scripture, names are not just your label. They're actually a description of your character. And that means that David is thankful not for how the name of God is pronounced, but for who God is. And he points out that people who seek the Lord are going to find a lot of reason for joy. Maybe you've been told that God is some kind of arbitrary tyrant who can't wait to crush you or remove you from existence. That's a picture handed down to us by the medieval church, which unfortunately specialized in serving up descriptions of a very severe and unloving God. That's why I always challenge people to actually read this book for themselves instead of just listening to what preachers say, because, well, a lot of preachers are still getting it wrong. And yes, there are difficult passages in the Bible and very honest descriptions of the moral mess that you and I have created. But if you're reading the Bible honestly, an amazing picture of God begins to surface. You find this God who takes His people back again and again and again, even after they've done some really horrible things. You'll find a God who gets angry when people hurt the weak and the vulnerable, a God whose heart breaks for the lonely and the rejected. You'll find a God whose love for you is so profound that He chose to abandon the glories of His own kingdom and live right here among us, not just with us, but as one of us. And then, of course, He loved us enough to give His life. And when you spend more time contemplating God's goodness, marinating in the astonishing revelation of who He actually is, compared to who we are, you really can't help but feel a lot more grateful. It puts the problems of this life into perspective. All right, on to verse 11, where it says, "Seek the Lord in His strength. Seek His presence continually. Remember the wondrous works that He has done, His miracles and the judgments He uttered, O offspring of Israel, His servant, children of Jacob, His chosen ones." You know, it's when you realize what God has already done for you that a lot of the grief that comes with living becomes easier to take. I mean, think about it. No matter what happens to me next, I'm ultimately going to be okay. And it's not that life is no longer painful, because, well, it is. Things like disappointment and betrayal really, really hurt. But they're easier to take when you consider a couple of things. Number one, I know that God has actually been here instead of isolating Himself from our pain. He knows what it means to be lonely or tired or hungry or even rejected. So we have a God who gets it. And I can trust that He knows what I'm talking about when I'm talking about my problems. But secondly, I also know that because God feels our pain and because He can't imagine a meaningful universe without us, He's going to set the record straight. So now all the bad stuff is just stuff, because I know it's not going to last forever. So I'm grateful, because when I feel weak, which is a lot of the time, David reminds me that I can seek the Lord in His strength. I don't have to be strong, because that's not even honest. None of us is strong all the time. And when we're not, we can lean on the strength of someone who made us in the first place and actually seek His presence. All right, I've got to take another quick break, but I'll be right back after this.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain. It's a place where the air is clear. So clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain. Free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
Retirement planning can be a stressful process, but it doesn't have to be. The friendly people at the Voice of Prophecy can walk you through the entire process and explain all of your options based on your specific needs. Whether you'd like to set up a trust for income or make a gift that will benefit your loved ones and change lives through the Voice of Prophecy, we're here to help. To learn more, call 1-800-348-5993.
This is Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Well, if you're just tuning in, we've been talking about the fact that gratitude is a choice, and it's really a very beneficial one. Even if you're not feeling it at the moment, there's something powerful in just practicing gratitude anyway. One of the things I've noticed over the years in my ministerial career is that sometimes it's the people who appear to have less who actually seem to have the better attitude. I've often found more thankfulness in poverty-stricken communities. And in some cases, it almost seems like the more we have to be thankful for, the less we seem to realize it. You've probably heard people laughing about some of our problems, calling them first world problems, and they kind of have a point. For example, it's easy to grumble about the goofball sitting next to you on the airplane who can't seem to figure out how to stop shaking his leg or chewing potato chips with his mouth open. But then I remind myself that it used to take months to cross this country, and it was really, really risky. And I remind myself that for a lot of the world, travel is still a privilege that's reserved for the very wealthy. And someone like me is traveling better than a king did just a few hundred years ago. Likewise, I can find myself on that parking lot known as the 405 freeway in LA, annoyed by the fact that I'm going to be late for my meeting because of some guy who obviously did something really stupid a mile up the road. Or I can choose to celebrate the fact that I'm privileged enough to have a car. I have this amazing machine that keeps me dry in a rainstorm and keeps me cool in the heat. It has a radio and comfortable seats, and it allows me to get from one place to another at speeds our ancestors couldn't have understood. Not when they maxed out at 20 miles a day. Now, that doesn't mean that my frustrations aren't real, and it doesn't mean that my pain isn't real either. It's really just a matter of choosing to reframe the world I live in so that I remember just how fortunate I am. In fact, I'm even fortunate to be alive. If you're at all aware of how reproduction works, you'll know that your very existence defied all the odds. To put it delicately, because this is pretty much a family show, you were the one successful candidate out of millions who made it to the point of fertility. Your existence on this planet is a remarkable gift. So here's what I want to challenge you with this week, because this is that one time of the year when everybody at least goes through the motions of being thankful. Maybe this week, reframe everything. Get in the habit of practicing gratitude. Refuse to get out of bed in the morning until you thank God for at least 3 things that you appreciate. And I know, it sounds like an after-school special, but maybe give it a try and see what happens. And I know, some days it really can be hard to be happy about something. But imagine if you suddenly became as good as happy as you are at complaining. Some of us are expert complainers, and some of us honestly even kind of enjoy it. We wouldn't know what to talk about if we weren't complaining. But what if it was possible to become just as talented at finding joy? You did teach yourself to be unhappy after all, so what if you could change that? I'm reminded of that story in the book of Luke where a group of lepers asked Jesus to heal them. I guess they'd heard about some of the things Jesus accomplished in his ministry, and they had their hopes way up. And honestly, if you were a leper back in those days, there wasn't much to be happy about. First of all, you had this debilitating disease that pretty much guaranteed a life of misery and an early death. Secondly, because this horrible disease was so contagious, you were sent away to live in a leper colony. And from that point forward, people were going to reject you on sight. They were going to run away because in their minds, you were the living dead. And getting close meant that you would probably suffer the same fate. So 10 of these men respectfully approached Jesus. Luke says they stood at a distance. They practiced social distancing. And Jesus told them to go to the priest for inspection. Now, it doesn't say they were healed on the spot, which I find interesting. It says Jesus sent them to the priest, and as they went, they were healed. So they actually had to exercise some faith in order to claim the gift of healing. And that's food for thought. But for this week, for the Thanksgiving holiday, I want to zero in on another fact that comes out of this same story. Among those 10 men, one of them was a Samaritan, and the Samaritans were held in contempt by the Jews. They had their own version of the Torah, and they had their own sacred mountain. And they were descended from a motley crew of outsiders placed into the land of Israel by the Assyrians. So in other words, they were considered unclean even when they didn't have leprosy. And in just a moment, I'll come back to tell you why that matters.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Sean Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
10 men were healed by Christ, and out of those 10, only one came back to say thanks. And in the minds of the religiously observant back in first century Judea, that man was the least likely candidate to find grace in the presence of God. He was a Samaritan, which means that he was an unclean social outcast even before he got leprosy. And that's who came back to say thanks. Even after his miracle, the Samaritan was going to go back to a life where the Jews of Jerusalem would probably despise him. After he was healed, it wasn't even likely that these other 9 guys, if they were Jewish, would ever talk to him again. And that's the man who was grateful. The story's found in Luke 17, where it says, "Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks." Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well." Now here's the thought for Thanksgiving. You and I have an awful lot to be thankful for, not the least of which is the fact that God is willing to forgive us and actually call us His children. According to Paul, we are no longer foreigners. We have been brought straight into the family of God. So what a shame if the only gratitude God might hear this week is from somebody else. Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? The answer to that should be no. Not on my watch, and not on your watch either. You and I have become really good at trotting out our problems in front of God, and that's okay because He's actually invited us to do that. Peter tells us that you can cast all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. And that means there's something else to be thankful for. You have a place you know you're going to be heard. And that's a key part of what the Levites were told to do. They were supposed to invoke the God of Israel. But they were also charged with gratitude, which is the other half of living authentically in the presence of God. Thanks for joining me, and you have a very happy Thanksgiving.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.